you. Hold on. It's still okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today, and look, really lovely to see some new names and new icons at the side there. That's really fabulous. And welcome to Mr. Lemure as well. So we're here today to listen to Mr. Birkinshaw talking about Dante. So I'm going to pass over to him now. Thank you so much, Mr. Birkinshaw.
Thanks very much, Ms. Hart. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks very much for coming along today. I know it's such a busy week. And I wanted to talk today because 2021 is the 700th anniversary of the death of Dante Alighieri, who's universally referred to as Dante, a single name. And I think it's just an interesting opportunity to reflect on why would we still read or celebrate an artist or writer 700 years, or an era really, 700 years after it's finished. How and what value does that have? How do we engage with writers like this or eras like this, which are so different to our own, and hopefully to sort of kind of think about some of those issues as we're sort of talking through his life and his work. And I just want to start with a few biographical details because I don't want to assume everyone knows everything about Dante. So he was born in 1265. He died in 1321, aged in his late 50s. As a young man, he wrote something called Vita Nuova, New Life, which was a revolutionary meditation on the nature of love, and it was inspired by his own love for Beatrice Portinari. He was also a politically active figure in his native city of Florence in Italy, which some of you may know or have been to. But as a result of the sort of conflict between different factions there, he was exiled. For the last 20 years of his life, he had to leave the city. He'd grown up in the city he loved, and he was never able to return. And it was while he was in exile that he wrote the other work for which he's most remembered today, which is known really nowadays as the Divine Comedy, although Dante himself never called it the Divine Comedy, he just called it the Comedy or the Commedia. And this was an epic poem in 3 parts, and it presents Dante going through an extraordinary journey through hell, which he calls the Inferno, and then purgatory, which is, some of you who know about sort of medieval history will know that in Catholic tradition, it was the belief you went there for a period of time for your sins and then could possibly then move on to heaven afterwards. And then finally, there is heaven, or paradiso, paradise. And here he once again meets the love of his life, who is the centre of his other book, Vita Nuova, Beatrice. Now, nothing quite like the Commedia had been written before, and this is why Dante remains, sort of 7 centuries later, and apologies in advance for my terrible Italian accent, the somma poeta, the greatest poet, the central figure in Italian literature. But I would argue, and I think part of what a point I want to make today, that he's not just some dead relic, that we dutifully honour every 100 years, but he's someone whose work contemporary artists continue to engage with in really exciting ways. And in Italy this year, the Italians are marking his anniversary with things like academic lectures and library exhibitions, as you would expect, but also, as you hopefully you can see up in here on the screen, music and dance performances, fashion shows, contemporary art exhibitions, video installations, public sculptures inspired by his work 700 years after his death. And perhaps the most striking of all will be something by someone called Liene Contini, who is planning a spiral mountain of waste called Mount Purgatorio, which promises to be quite exciting. And in addition, we can still see his continuing impact on objects as central to our current culture as computer games. You can see there Dante's Inferno, and face masks, people walking proudly around in Italy and Rome and places in Florence with Dante's face and a quotation on their mask. Now, these celebrations, especially in this year of lockdown, include podcasts analysing pretty much every word Dante ever wrote, and via social media, if you want to, every day you can follow Parola di Dante Fresca di Giornata, which is a new word from Dante for each day of the year. And this is as it should be, really, because language is central to Dante's cultural influence and his importance. His Commedia and Vita Nuova were the first significant literary works written in the vernacular, in other words, the everyday language spoken by ordinary people, rather than the Latin, which at the time was reserved for the educated, the literate, and often the very powerful. And the word commedia itself is interesting because obviously our literal translation is comedy, but it doesn't just mean that it has a happy ending in that sort of Shakespearean sense, but it's something written in the common, commedia and common everyday language. And this may seem blindingly obvious to us that we write in the language we speak, but that was not the case at the time. As I say, Latin really, and for some people maybe educated French, was the language, and it was not the language ordinary people were speaking. And the impact of Dante's work, the fact that he was using ordinary spoken language to write this extraordinary, sophisticated poetry and prose, was such that his own sort of Tuscan dialect is essentially evolved into what is really modern day Italian, the language for the whole country. Such was the cultural linguistic impact of his work. And his use of ordinary vernacular language was reflecting a shift. He's not operating in a vacuum here. So it reflected a sort of shift in theology, which had begun in the 12th century. And this was away from kind of ritual and ceremony towards more a focus on the inner life. And the picture there you can see at the top is a man, a sort of Christian, so having this personal relationship with Jesus, personal relationship with God, and as you can see, relating around language with those scrolls, that communication. And this is quite significant because it placed an increasing value on being an individual, your individual relationship with God, rather than going to a church and just being part of a ceremony, often which you didn't understand the language of. It's about authenticity. You're saying what you feel, it's real. And you're being original. You're all praying or you're all talking to God in your own individual way. And this is accompanied, therefore, by an intensification of one's ability to be imaginative, to be introspective. And we can sort of see that top picture in the middle there, the man looking in the mirror, Narcissus in the mirror. This idea of looking at ourselves and looking within ourselves and becoming more self-conscious. And this is happening, of course, in line with the development in language. And language is reflecting this development in consciousness. And Dante was central to the fusion of this religious sense and the romantic sense. He brought together religious love and romantic love, relationship with God and relationship with another human being. And this idea of religious and romantic ecstasy helping in the process to transform the nature of human relationships. And our modern idea of two individuals being able to love each other individually and spiritually and as equals and mutual has its roots really in this massive shift in the way that people relate to each other and talk about each other and interact with each other. And Dante himself was conscious that what he was doing was new. His literary movement was called Dolce Stil Novo, which means the sweet new style. And it reflected a revolution, as I say, not just in its use of vernacular language, but also in the transformation of literary form. And as obviously in literary society here, we are interested in this idea of form and how we structure our language and how we structure our expression. And the complex metrical structures of cantos and canzones and sonnets, which you're all very familiar with, enabled these writers to explore human experience and emotion in ways which were mystical, sexual, philosophical, witty, but always subtle and intricate in ways which just hadn't been seen for many, many, many centuries before. And this reached a peak, an expressive peak, with Dante's Vita Nuova, his new love. And 600 years later, the poet T.S. Eliot paid tribute to Dante. He said, to pass on to posterity one's own language, more highly developed, more refined, and more precise than it was before one wrote in it, that is the highest possible achievement of the poet. And of course, he's referring there to Dante. And he inspired younger poets. Giovanni Boccaccio, you see top left, Francesco Petrarca, those of you familiar with the Petrarchan sonnet, bottom left, who in turn influenced and met the English writer Geoffrey Chaucer, top right. And Chaucer revolutionized English literature and language by introducing Italian innovations, the syllabic meter, which is central to the canzonian sonnet, but was not really known in English at the time, which tended to be alliteration. It was a 5-stress line, the one that you're very familiar with, that evolved into the iambic pentameter, which then remained central to English poetry from around Chaucer's time, 1400, right up to 1900, really right up to the time of T.S. Eliot and the modernists. And that just gave, as in Italy, a flexibility and a fluidity of poetic style to English literature, which enabled a heightening of expression and consciousness, just like we've seen in Italy, that was to have real profound cultural and social consequences. So not just in Italy is Dante's effect or impact there, but across Europe, really, and obviously beyond that, across the world. And not just a sort of literary and linguistic impact, but a social and cultural impact, impacting all sorts of areas, from gender and sexuality, social equality. All of these things are tied up together in this incredibly dramatic and exciting period in history. And such was the case that when Philip Sidney wrote his Defence of Poesy during Shakespeare's age in about 1600, that he compared Chaucer directly to Dante in their respective impact on the language and literature and culture in which they had both lived. Now, 300 years later, this cultural self-confidence that Sidney was celebrating lay shattered by the devastation of the First World War. Now, we've seen the transformative impact of Dante's love poetry, the Vita Nuova, but it's his other great work, the Commedia, which has really resonated with modern artists. And in particular, the first part we talked about, the Inferno, hell. And here on the left, we can see Paul Nash's portrayal of no man's land in the First World War on Western Front as a Stygian landscape, straight out of Dante. While on the right, we can see John Singer Sargent, American artists, gassed British soldiers who here are presented as if their souls suffering in the hell of the Western Front, waiting to cross the River Styx in Dante's Inferno. And we can also appreciate the Welsh German artist Otto Dix on the right there has been influenced in his portrayal of German soldiers advancing during a gas attack in the First World War by a sort of Dantean image of inhuman and dehumanizing terror there on the left in that sort of medieval portrait, also inspired by Dante. And the war felt like an apocalypse. It felt like a violent severing of the past from the present. And amidst that cultural wreckage, while people like Nash and Sargent and Dix were painting their hellish visions, there was a young poet, T.S. Eliot, an American poet living in England, was writing one of the most influential literary essays of the modern era. And I want to dwell on this for a minute or so, because I think this is really central to what I want to talk about today. He wrote Tradition and the Individual Talent, about this relationship between the modern artist, the modern writer, and those who have gone before. And he wrote, tradition involves a perception not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. The historical sense compels a writer to write not merely with their own generation in their bones, but with a feeling that the whole of literature has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. This is what makes a writer traditional, and it's at the same time what makes a writer most acutely conscious of their place in time, of their own contemporaneity. No poet, no artist of any art has their complete meaning alone. Their significance, their appreciation is the appreciation of their relation to the dead poets and artists. When a new work of art is created, all the works of art which preceded it are altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past. And I just find this really fascinating. I think Eliot's making three really crucial and really rather revolutionary points here, that no artist can have significance unrelated to the artists that precede them. The second point being that past and present are interfused, interconnected, so that to be traditional is to be contemporary and vice versa. And finally, and I think this is the most interesting bit, he sort of says that each new work of art is not just shaped by past works. That bit seems kind of obvious, but every time a new work is created, it alters the way we perceive and experience those past works. So the past works are influenced and changed just as the modern ones are. And I think, therefore, one could argue that Eliot's point suggests that culture can therefore be seen as a network, perhaps even an ecosystem. You change one part of the system will involve change to the whole system. Now, the complexity of this relationship between past and present that T.S. Eliot was talking about is really exemplified in Dante's Commedia. The central figure is Dante, who's pictured there on the left, but he is guided through the Christian landscape of the Inferno and the Purgatorio by Virgil, the man on the right, who was a pagan poet who died 1300 years before Dante was born. And of course, this is a Christian poem, but Virgil died 20 years in before Christ. So just as Eliot described, Dante is going back to the past, to this poet who died 1300 years before him, for inspiration. He's bringing the past into the present. He's making Virgil and himself, as they walk through the Inferno and Purgatorio together as comrades, through their shared literary experience, they are becoming contemporaries. And he's also pronouncing his own significance in relation to the great literary forebear, which is an act of great artistic audacity, and one might even say arrogance. And ultimately, Dante's representation of hell owes more to classical literature and to Virgil's Aeneid in particular than it does to Holy Scripture, even though it's a Christian landscape. For example, when he describes the damned souls in a way that evokes not condemnation, but pathos in words and language that sort of echo Virgil in Book 6 when Aeneas goes down into the underworld. And he describes the dead in hell as winter starlings riding on their wings, form crowded flocks, so spirits dip and veer, foundering in the wind's rough buffetings. It's a beautiful description. It's a sort of a sad and poignant description. These are not sort of words of condemnation, but words of pathos. And as we talked about before, it's also very difficult now when you go back and read Aeneid Book 6, for example, written 1300 years before the Commedia, to read it without being able to also think of Dante's Hell, Dante's Inferno. And this goes back to what Eliot's saying about the way that modern literature will always end up shaping our view of past literature. Dante's very conscious of this relationship between past and present, and it's significant that the Commedia begins with the phrase nel mezzo, in the middle. This is the first line of the poem. Midway on our life's journey, I found myself in dark woods, the right road lost. Now, this is often read as an autobiographical description of a midlife crisis, triggered very possibly by his exile from Florence. But the image also suggests the sense of the poem itself as a node, if we think of that network image, a nodal point of intersection between the classical and the Christian pathways, between Aeneid and between the Commedia. And the idea that from these two pathways, the classical and the Christian, is coming something new and completely distinctive. And this is a process which is as painful as it is triumphant. Dante writes, "To tell about those woods is hard, so tangled and rough and savage, that thinking of it now I feel the old fear stirring. Death is hardly more bitter." And there's a sense of the modern as not just being influenced by the past, but here tangled up with it, haunted by it, in competition with it. It's a conflicted relationship, not an easy one. Critic Harold Bloom explored this in his fascinating work, The Anxiety of Influence, the 1970s, and he presented the engagement between artists as rather like a Freudian struggle. It's liberating, but it's also debilitating. And at the end of Purgatorio, very interesting, this is the second book in the three-part Commedia, Virgil can't go any further. It's partly because as a pagan, he's not allowed to enter paradise or heaven. And it also is there to symbolize the limits of human reason, which is what he represents in relation to Christian faith. However, I would argue that on an artistic level, Dante is also showing himself as having surpassed his mentor. He's able to reach greater artistic heights going up to Paradiso. And furthermore, Dante's modern Italian language is now superseding Virgil's classical Latin in its expressive power. And it's worth noting the artistic triumph here is a more convincing one than the religious triumph. And then when Dante's transfiguration comes at the end of Paradiso, it's through the love of Beatrice, who appears in Paradiso, and she becomes his guide through Paradiso once Virgil can go no further. And in many ways, it seems to owe more to the philosophy of Plato and Plotinus, going back to the classics, than it does to Holy Scripture. And even the beautiful image of God at the end of Paradiso is these three circles of light. Again, it seems more Plotinian, more Platonistic than it does perhaps rooted in the language of the Christian text that Dante is writing in the tradition of. And so I would argue that whether he intends it to be or not, the Commedia is a subversive work, not just artistically, but also philosophically. And I think it's that subversive quality is what artists were still responding to 500 years after Dante's death. So this revolutionary through Chaucer and others, Dante then was revisited by poets and artists in the 19th century. And that includes the Rossettis, Christina, the poet, and Dante, the artist. And you can see two of Dante Gabriel Rossetti's paintings of Beatrice here. The attraction of Dante to these artists, these poets and writers, was that in the 19th century, in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, the rise of empire, the rise of capitalism, these things going on, that to these artists, Dante represented something, a return, a search for a spiritual aesthetic to counter what they saw as a sterile materialism, the sterility of modernity. And as we can see here, these paintings communicate that sense of spirituality, which these artists were finding or rediscovering in Dante. And half a century after the Rossettis, the modernist writers, including Virginia Woolf, we see here, Samuel Beckett, James Joyce, they were seeking a linguistic precision, an experimentalism with form, and an intellectual complexity that they felt to be missing from their Victorian predecessors. And it was to Dante that these modernist writers returned to also. Now, the modernist credo was make it new. Make it new. But as Eliot had argued, T.S. Eliot on the right there, renewal required a reckoning with the past. Eliot's Wasteland is seen often as the greatest modernist poem of all. And he dedicated it to his poetic mentor, Ezra Pound, who's in the middle there. And he referred to him in the epigraph at the beginning as Miglior Fabbrio, the greater craftsman or the greater artist. And Eliot deliberately used the same epithet to describe Pound as Dante had used to describe his literary idol, who you see on the left there, Arnaud Daniel. And through reading Dante, Ezra Pound discovered the work of Arnaud on the left, and that revolutionized Pound's own poetry, and through his influence, he transformed Eliot's work, and The Wasteland was the result. And thus the phrase Il Miglio Fabio, the greater craftsman, becomes another node, a very resonant node, maybe even you might say a meme, connecting two transformative artistic relationships across 7 centuries. And again, it's the present is paying homage to the past in the act of declaring its independence from the past, celebrating its own artistic revolution. Now, before his death at a young age, half a century before Dante's birth, this poet we just talked about, Arnaud Daniel, had written a small number of complex and inventive poems in his own native Provençal language. And in the second part of the Commedia, Purgatorio, Dante shows Arnaud as paying a spiritual price for his rather sybaritic life. However, he offers Arnaud a unique compliment of quoting him in his own language. So what you're seeing in blue on screen there is not Italian, it's Provençal. It's the language of southeastern France that Arnaud had written his poetry in. And it's a unique compliment from one artist to another to acknowledge the man who taught him the expressive power of writing in your own vernacular language. And throughout the Commedia, we encounter not just characters from scripture and classical mythology, but people Dante knew in real life. Figures in from history, from contemporary politics, but also people like Arnaud who'd influenced him. And many of the most poignant encounters in the Inferno are where he is describing the tension between human frailty and what he would see as kind of unbending Christian doctrine. And in Canto 15, he meets another mentor, and this time he knew personally, the man you can see just second from the left there, with the sort of white and green cap, Brunetto Latini, who was his beloved teacher. He was a founder member of the Dolce Stil Nuovo movement. And there's a heart-stopping moment when he realizes his friend is in hell, and he is there because his sexuality is forbidden by the church. And he says, "Are you here, dear Brunetto?" In complete disbelief. And then he sort of just offers no reference to why Brunetto is there, but simply gratitude for everything Brunetto has done for him. And then in Canto 5, Dante encounters someone else that he probably also knew in real life, someone called Francesca de Polenta, who had fallen in love with Paolo, the brother of her husband Giovanni, and their affair was discovered. This was a true story, and she and Paolo were both murdered by her husband Giovanni. The image you see here is a very famous, one of the most famous sculptures probably ever created, Rodin's Kiss from the 1880s. And what's interesting, it's one of the most powerful celebrations of love and sexuality ever created in art. And yet, intriguingly, Rodin's figures are Dante's Francesca and Paolo, who are inseparable, even as they suffer for their love in hell. And Francesca explains to Dante, "Love which absolves none who are loved from loving made my heart burn with joy so strong that as you see it cleaves still to him." And here this couple with forbidden love in hell, and they are inseparable. And it's an extraordinary sort of power to that moment. And then adding to the poignancy is the fact that they fell in love whilst reading the Arthurian legend about Guinevere and Lancelot, their forbidden love. And what we see here is that Dante is so moved that he actually questions divine justice. He says, "Alas, that sweet conception and passion so deep should bring them here." And then he swoons, almost undergoing a spiritual death. And perhaps he's moved by their suffering, but perhaps also he is conflicted, maybe guilty, about the fact that at the heart of his own poetic movement and his own writing is a celebration of natural human love that seems to be in conflict with what he might see as quite a sort of a demanding Christian doctrine. It's striking, in fact, how a poem which is still cited as so emblematic of medieval Catholic Christianity is condemnatory of the church. Here we see this image of, amongst others, Nicholas III, the Pope, being punished for his outrageous corruption. And interestingly, there's a reference that Pope Boniface VIII, who was still around the time this book was being written, was announced to be on his way to suffer the same punishment. And it's therefore equally striking that also in the Commedia in Canto 4, we have a description of limbo, which is a place where you go if you're not a Christian, but if you've led a good life, for those born before Christ or outside the Christian faith. And what we see here are some of the great figures, not just Plato, Socrates, Ovid from the classical era, but Islamic philosophers, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd. And Dante is acknowledging the essential role played by Islamic scholars in not only curating the works of classical writers, but also undertaking work in the field of medicine, science, and literature that far surpassed intellectual culture achievements in Christian Europe in the early medieval period. And what's really striking, if you look at the picture on the right, is his admiring presentation of Saladin, the Muslim sultan who successfully fought against and killed many Christian crusaders in the 12th century. And that sort of treatment with respect, that treatment with admiration, really, is helps us appreciate that perspectives relating to race and religion in this period were complex, just as they were regarding gender and sexuality. We now use the adjective medieval to just suggest barbarism, but it was in the era of scientific modernity, our own era, that the horror of the Holocaust took place, with its attempted erasure of that very diversity and individuality that we see celebrated in Dante. One of the great works on the Holocaust is If This Is a Man by Primo Levi, an Italian Jewish prisoner in Auschwitz. And Levi describes his experience in Dantean terms as the descent into the inferno. The Nazi camps are designed to reduce human beings to an animal existence, living in a permanent present, robbed of cultural memory, robbed of identity and dignity. And a central chapter in his book, Levi titles The Canto of Ulysses, i.e. Dante's Canto 26, and Levi quotes Ulysses' defiant words in Dante's Inferno. You were not born to live as a mere brute does, but for the pursuit of knowledge and the good. And there's a comparison here between Levi's position as an Italian and as a Jew in this camp of Auschwitz and Ulysses' position in the Inferno in hell. And Levi's attempt to remember the verses and language from Canto 26 in his terrible situation is agonizingly hard, as he seeks to reclaim a memory of his cultural and linguistic history in order to preserve his very identity and his very humanity. Now, Erich Auerbach was luckier than Primo Levi. He was a German Jewish linguist. He barely escaped Hitler's Germany in time with little more than a suitcase full of clothes, and he left behind his beloved personal library. And in exile in Istanbul throughout the Second World War, with nothing but his own extraordinary learning and powerful memory to hand, Auerbach wrote possibly the greatest work of literary criticism of the 20th century, Mimesis. And it explores the representation of reality from Homer to Virginia Woolf, all from memory with no access to library or results. And so at the same time that Primo Levi was struggling to recall the lines of Dante in Auschwitz in the face of a Nazi attempt to extinguish not just his identity but his existence, Auerbach drew a memory to write a monumental history of European literature that sought to celebrate the cultural web that Nazism sought to eradicate. And as a Dante scholar, Auerbach noted parallels between his own situation in Istanbul and the 20 years that Dante had spent in exile from Florence. As critic John Fracero writes, hell is the state of the soul after death, but it's also the state of the world as seen by an exile whose experience has taught him no longer to trust the world's values. Dante's Commedia, like Auerbach's Mimesis, is an attempt to rebuild a system of value and meaning in the face of chaos and nihilism. Auerbach argues that the complexity and pathos of Dante's presentation of the characters who suffer in Inferno and Purgatorio undermine or subvert his philosophical intention to demonstrate the justice of Christian doctrine. We find ourselves moved by the souls in hell, despite the moral system that condemns them so pitilessly. And indeed, as we see the blessed spirits at the conclusion of Paradiso, we can't fail to recall the image of those tormented souls in Inferno as starlings buffeted by the winter winds, and nor surely could Dante. Another writer hugely influenced by Dante was the 17th century English poet John Milton. In Paradise Lost, Milton's philosophical purpose is, like Dante's, to justify the ways of God to man. However, this is subverted by his sympathetic, even tragic portrayal of Satan in hell, which itself is influenced by Dante's description of Ulysses, which so inspired Primo Levi in Auschwitz. In Milton's God, a book by the literary critic William Empson, he argues that Milton's artistic triumph in Paradise Lost is not in spite of the philosophical failure of the poem, but because of it. Where divine justice sees only black and white, the artist finds complexity. And like Milton, Dante is warning us, consciously or not, of the danger of systemization and categorization that erase the diversity, the individuality, and the contradictions that lie at the heart of human experience, and therefore of language and literature. Now, this month, Leicester University's hit the headlines with the decision to drop the medieval module, i.e. all literature before 1500, which of course includes Chaucer and Dante, from its English course. And many have protested this policy, including the person you can see bottom right there, Leicester English student and former PGS pupil, Rhiannon Jenkins, who in an interview with the BBC argued the student body does want decolonisation. We disagree that it's synonymous with getting rid of medievalism and early modern English literature. Now, a stated aim of decolonising the curriculum is to widen the range of perspectives explored through literature, making space to think carefully about what we value. And this is admirable and it's right. But I would argue that removing from an English literature course an era as significant and transformative as the age of Dante narrows that space considerably, restricting our historical cultural memory with potentially dangerous consequences. And I think it's essential that literature departments continue to bring new and marginalised writers into the curriculum and to review all the time what we mean by the literary canon. But we should never cease to engage with traditional voices. That's what Dante himself did in the Commedia, from Homer and Virgil to Arnaud Daniel, Francesca de Polenta, Saladin. And that is what I think artists and writers have been doing with Dante ever since. In response to Leicester's decision, Dr. Christine Rower of St Andrews said, "You'll feel left out if you only know half the story." And I think it goes even further than that. I think if you start removing parts of the narrative or parts of the web, the network crashes and the ecosystem dies. Thank you very much for listening.
I'm sure everyone round of applause. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mr. Birkinshaw.
Sorry, it went a bit longer than it should have done, really.
Oh, it was fascinating. I'm sure that there are questions or comments. Does anybody want to share any thoughts?
Thank you, Ms. Lumiere. That's very kind.
I was going to ask, well, actually, this is not really a question. Oh, actually, no, we have a question. I'm going to just go to Raphael. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I was really interested. I've read about Dante in the past and his description of there's 9 different layers of hell.
Yeah.
I just wanted to know, what do you know the orders of it, or are you sure of them?
Again, I set myself as an expert, which I'm not really, but I think essentially, in a nutshell, as you go, the 9th circle is the deepest circle. And I think the earliest circles are the ones where people are driven by passions, which are difficult to control. And as you get deeper and deeper, it's more like, so people like fraudsters and tricksters and liars, people who've done things which are consciously using almost like your intellectual, logical skills to do bad things, they get punished more deeply. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I see. Thank you.
Whereas people who just follow their desires and sort of do things which are unfortunate but don't have control of are punished less harshly. But having said that, they're all in hell. The thing the interesting one is the difference between Inferno and Purgatorio, because Purgatorio you have the chance eventually to be saved, and that one is more interesting. So does that?
Thank you.
Another thing, I think it's really interesting how different sort of religions, like the Jews and the Muslims, like Saladin, how they have a part in it as well. It's not just the way that Dante described it. It's not all very Christian perspective. If that makes sense.
I think that's right. I think personally, as I say, that's why I find it so interesting, because I think when you're an artist, you have to deal with the reality and complexity of life. And I think he sees people as individuals and as humans. And I think it is interesting, you say that he's sticking some popes in hell, and he's got someone like Saladin, who was a great sort of opponent of the Christian Crusaders, as someone who's held up as someone admirable. And I think, as you write as well, that the interaction between Islamic culture, Islamic philosophers, Islamic writers, Islamic scientists in that period is really, really crucial, and something I think that, again, this is why I find someone like Leicester's decision to remove this era from study odd, because it seems to me if you're looking to have a decolonized and complex and multicultural era of history, if you like, this is an extraordinary example of it.
Thank you, Mr. Birkinshaw. The one thing that I come away with from your talk is really about the interconnectedness of literature, because I've always felt that, but actually your talk really crystallized it for me today, that actually everything is connected. And so that if you do go into study literature, you can't possibly just study a certain kind of area of literature and ignore everything else, because everything is part of a whole. And I thought there was a lovely quotation, but I've written it down because it was just so lovely. No artist of any art has their complete meaning alone. And I just thought that was such an interesting way of viewing it. And I think that's how we should view English, but also the humanities, that the humanities and English and arts and all those types of subjects are so interconnected and reliant on each other, and there's a richness to them that perhaps maybe is getting lost. We were having this conversation earlier, weren't we, Mr. Birkinshaw, that maybe those things are getting lost in the modern era, and that's such a shame.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I mean, you always get in a bit of trouble when you sort of talk about, but I was talking about sort of what they're trying to do in the camp in Auschwitz is remove anyone's sense of their own identity or history or the past, and everyone lives in a permanent present because they're just living on desperately, just trying to survive from second to second. But of course, things like tech and everything else, it's not an intentional part of that, but there's an element in which everything gets blended. So do you lose that sense of layers? Do you lose that sense of the web in a different kind of web, I suppose? And I think it just raises questions as to, every new development, as we can see from this era, comes with excitement and possibility, but it also comes with its challenges, maybe. And maybe that's our challenge of our time.
Well, thank you so much for today's presentation. It was absolutely phenomenal. I was going to ask a really cheeky favour. Would you be able to put together a reading list? Because you mentioned lots of books in your presentation. Yeah. And that I think that there are lots of people that would probably want to follow up some of the books that you were mentioning.
Yeah, there's a lot of really great stuff there to look at. Yeah, definitely. That'd be fantastic. So thank you very much. I'm sorry I ran on a bit. So if anyone does have any questions or wants to ask anything, just let me know. I've got to go off a teaching meet like everyone else probably will learn. So thank you to Mr. Lemire for his John Donne quote there, proving the whole in literature, history, interchange there. Useful. Thank you. Well, thanks for coming on and take care.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.